What if I told you that for 300 years, Europe systematically murdered women for the crime of existing? Between the 15th and 18th centuries, an estimated 100,000 people were tortured and killed in the name of fighting evil, yet the real monsters were the ones holding the torches. Today, when we think of the medieval witch trials, we often imagine quaint stories of women accused of brewing love potions or flying on broomsticks. Hollywood has sanitized these events into tales of supernatural romance or comedic mishaps. But the truth is far darker than any horror movie could portray. These weren't isolated incidents of village superstition. This was organized, systematic genocide that tore apart the fabric of European society and left scars that echo into our modern world. The roots of this nightmare began not with ignorant peasants pointing fingers, but with the highest levels of the Catholic Church. In 1484, Pope Innocent VIII issued a papal bull that essentially declared open season on women. This document, known as Summis Desiderans Effectibus, granted special investigators unlimited power to hunt down suspected practitioners of magic. But why would the most powerful institution in medieval Europe suddenly become obsessed with village-wise women? The answer lies in control. The late medieval period was a time of unprecedented social upheaval. The Black Death had killed 1/3 of Europe's population, traditional social structures were crumbling, and the Church's authority was being questioned. Women, particularly those who possessed knowledge of herbal medicine or who lived independently, represented a threat to the established order. They needed to be brought into line, and terror would be the weapon of choice. The blueprint for this campaign of terror came in 1487 with the publication of perhaps the most dangerous book ever written, the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches. Written by two German inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, this manual became the second best-selling book of its time, surpassed only by the Bible itself. But where the Bible preached love and forgiveness, the Malleus preached hatred and murder. The book's central thesis was breathtakingly misogynistic. Women were inherently weaker than men and therefore more susceptible to the devil's influence. According to the authors, women's natural inclinations toward jealousy, vanity, and sexual desire made them perfect vessels for evil. The manual provided step-by-step instructions for identifying, interrogating, and executing suspected witches. It became the legal foundation for 3 centuries of state-sanctioned murder. What made the Malleus particularly insidious was its scientific pretense. The authors presented their hatred as scholarly research, complete with theological arguments and legal precedents. They transformed centuries-old folklore about wise women into a coherent theory of organized supernatural conspiracy. According to their framework, witches weren't acting alone but were part of a vast network of devil worshippers plotting to destroy Christian civilization. The book answered every possible objection to witch hunting with deadly logic. If someone doubted the existence of witches, they were obviously under demonic influence. If an accused person maintained their innocence, this proved the devil was protecting them. If they confessed, this confirmed their guilt. If they died under torture, God had delivered his judgment. There was literally no way for an accused person to prove their innocence within this system. Perhaps most chilling was the book's assertion that showing mercy to accused witches was itself a form of heresy. Judges who hesitated to order torture or execution were threatened with accusations of witchcraft themselves. This created a climate of fear even among those in positions of authority, ensuring that the machinery of persecution would continue to operate regardless of individual conscience. The spread of witch hunting was facilitated by the relatively new technology of the printing press. Within decades, copies of the Malleus could be found in every courthouse and monastery across Europe. The book was translated into multiple languages and adapted to local customs, ensuring that persecution would follow similar patterns regardless of geography. What had started as German paranoia became a continental epidemic. The methods used to identify witches were designed to ensure that innocence was impossible to prove. The most infamous was the swimming test, a lose-lose proposition if there ever was one. Suspected witches were bound hand and foot and thrown into deep water. If they floated, this proved they were witches and they would be executed. If they sank and drowned, they were declared innocent posthumously. Either way, they died. The search for the devil's mark involved stripping accused women naked and examining every inch of their bodies for moles, scars, or birthmarks that could be interpreted as signs of demonic possession. Professional witch-finders traveled from town to town, carrying specially designed needles with retractable points that created the illusion of areas on the body that couldn't feel pain. These charlatans grew wealthy from the fees they charged communities for their deadly services. Sleep deprivation was another favorite technique. Accused witches were kept awake for days or weeks until exhaustion and hallucination set in. Guards would take shifts ensuring the victim never lost consciousness, believing that the moment a witch fell asleep, devils would appear to comfort them. The resulting delirium was taken as evidence of supernatural communication. But these preliminary torments were nothing compared to what awaited those who were formally accused. The torture chambers of the Inquisition became laboratories of human suffering, where pain was refined into an art form. The rack slowly stretched victims until their joints separated and bones cracked. The strappado lifted accused witches by their bound arms until their shoulders dislocated, leaving them dangling in agony for hours. Thumbscrews crushed fingers bone by bone, while the Iron Maiden's spikes pierced flesh in carefully calculated patterns designed to maximize pain while preventing death. Women faced additional gender-specific tortures that reflected society's deep-seated hatred of female independence and sexuality. The breast ripper tore flesh from nursing mothers accused of cursing infants. The pear of anguish, inserted into the vagina or mouth, expanded to cause internal damage. Pregnant women were tortured until they miscarried, as their unborn children were considered potential servants of Satan. The confessions extracted through these torments followed predictable patterns that revealed more about the fantasies of the torturers than any supernatural reality. Victims confessed to flying through the night on broomsticks, transforming into animals, attending demonic orgies, and cannibalism. They named accomplices, usually other vulnerable women, creating expanding circles of accusations that could devastate entire communities. The concept of the witches' Sabbath became central to confessions across Europe, with remarkably consistent details despite geographical and cultural differences. Accused witches described gathering at midnight in remote locations where they would meet with Satan himself. These gatherings allegedly involved the renunciation of Christianity, sexual encounters with demons, the sacrifice of infants, and the planning of magical attacks against Christian communities. These Sabbath confessions revealed the sexual anxieties that drove much of the persecution. Accused women were forced to describe in graphic detail their alleged sexual encounters with Satan and his demons, providing titillation disguised as religious investigation. The obsession with sexual details in which confessions reflects the deeply misogynistic nature of the trials, where female sexuality was inherently suspect and evidence of supernatural corruption. Children were not spared from this madness. In many regions, youngsters as young as 7 were executed as witches, their small bodies burned at stakes while crowds cheered. The case of the Pendle witches in England included a 9-year-old girl who testified against her own family members, sending her mother and siblings to their deaths. Children were considered especially valuable witnesses because of their supposed innocence, making their accusations particularly damaging. The economic motivations behind witch accusations became clear when examining patterns of property confiscation. Wealthy widows became particular targets, their independence and resources making them both enviable and vulnerable. The estates of executed witches were divided between the church, local authorities, and accusers, creating powerful financial incentives for persecution. The witch trials became a mechanism for redistributing wealth from women to men, from the powerless to the powerful. Some of history's most devastating witch hunts occurred in the German states of Würzburg and Bamberg, where prince-bishops orchestrated campaigns of terror that claimed over 1,000 lives between 1626 and 1631. These authorities built special prisons and execution grounds to accommodate the volume of victims, turning murder into an industrial process. The Würzburg trials became notorious for their systematic approach, with Prince Bishop Dornheim constructing a special prison called the Maleficarum House, specifically for accused witches. In Sweden, the Torsäker witch trials of 1675 saw 71 people executed in a single day, making it one of the bloodiest witch hunts in Scandinavian history. The mass execution was conducted with assembly line efficiency as victims were beheaded and burned in carefully orchestrated public spectacles designed to terrorize the population into submission. Scotland's witch trials, encouraged by King James VI, later James I of England, were particularly savage. The king's personal obsession with witchcraft led to the torture and execution of thousands of Scottish women. James himself attended many interrogations, taking personal pleasure in the suffering of the accused. His book, Demonology, provided theological justification for witch hunting, arguing that witches posed an existential threat to royal authority and Christian society. The Spanish Inquisition's persecution of Basque witches resulted in over 7,000 accusations and hundreds of executions in the early 17th century. Spanish inquisitors developed particularly sophisticated torture techniques, including the garrucha and the taca, which simulated drowning. The efficiency of Spanish persecution became a model for other European authorities. Public executions were carefully choreographed theater designed to reinforce social hierarchies and religious authority. Victims were paraded through streets on carts, surrounded by jeering crowds who pelted them with stones and filth. The condemned were forced to wear pointed caps and yellow robes marked with demonic symbols, transforming them into living symbols of evil. The burning stake was not the only method of execution. In some regions, accused witches were hanged, their bodies left to rot on gibbets as warnings to others. The breaking will crushed bones systematically, leaving victims to die slowly over hours or days. Some were boiled alive in oil or water, while others were torn apart by horses. The creativity of cruelty seemed limitless as authorities competed to devise deaths that would maximize both suffering and public terror. The hysteria eventually crossed the Atlantic, finding new soil in the Puritan communities of New England. The Salem witch trials of 1692 to 1693 resulted in 20 executions and revealed that the European madness had not been contained by an ocean. The same accusations, the same procedures, and the same judicial murders were repeated in the New World, proving that the capacity for such cruelty was a universal human failing. The role of spectral evidence in the Salem trials highlighted the absurd logic that underpinned witch persecution everywhere. Accusers claimed they could see the spirits of accused witches attacking them, even when the accused were physically present elsewhere. This supernatural testimony was accepted by courts as valid evidence, making defense virtually impossible. By the early 18th century, the witch trials began to decline as Enlightenment thinking spread across Europe and America. Scientists and philosophers challenged the supernatural worldview that had enabled the persecutions, while legal reforms made torture and spectral evidence inadmissible in courts. The growing influence of rationalism gradually exposed the trials for what they had always been: mass murder disguised as justice. The decline was gradual and uneven. The last legal execution for witchcraft in Europe occurred in 1782 in Switzerland, while illegal lynchings and mob violence against suspected witches continued into the 19th century. The persistence of witch beliefs despite legal and intellectual challenges demonstrates how deeply embedded these fears had become in popular culture. The final toll of the European witch trials remains debated among historians, but conservative estimates suggest that between 40,000 and 60,000 people were executed as witches over 3 centuries. Recent scholarship suggests the actual number may have exceeded 100,000 when including those who died under torture or in prison. Women comprised roughly 80% of the victims, though the percentage varied by region. The geographic distribution of witch trials reveals important patterns about the social and political factors that enabled persecution. Regions with weak central authority, religious conflict, or economic instability experienced more intense witch hunting than areas with strong governmental institutions. Border regions where competing jurisdictions created legal confusion became particularly dangerous for those accused of witchcraft. The witch trials established precedents for state-sanctioned persecution that would echo through subsequent centuries in pogroms, genocides, and political purges. The mechanisms of accusation, torture, and execution developed during the witch hunts provided blueprints for later campaigns of terror. The trials demonstrated how legal systems could be corrupted to serve political and social agendas. Modern scholars have recognized the witch trials as fundamentally gendered violence, representing perhaps the largest campaign of femicide in European history. The trials targeted women's knowledge, independence, and sexuality, seeking to reimpose patriarchal control over female bodies and minds. Women who were too outspoken, too independent, or too knowledgeable faced increased risk of accusation. The witch trials revealed the dangerous power of mass hysteria and the fragility of civilized behavior. They showed how quickly neighbors could turn against each other when authorities provided scapegoats for social problems. Fear proved to be a universal solvent, dissolving the bonds of family, friendship, and community. The psychological mechanisms that enabled witch persecution, scapegoating, in-group versus out-group thinking, and the need to explain suffering through human agency remain active in human societies today. The witch trials serve as a case study in how these psychological tendencies can be manipulated by those seeking power or attempting to deflect responsibility for social problems. Perhaps most disturbing is the recognition that the witch trials were not aberrations but logical extensions of the societies that created them. They reflected existing prejudices against women, outsiders, and the powerless, amplifying these biases into lethal force. The trials succeeded not despite the social order, but because of it. This understanding challenges comfortable assumptions about progress and human nature. The societies that conducted witch trials were not primitive or ignorant by the standards of their time. They were often sophisticated, literate, and technologically advanced. The persecution of witches occurred during periods of cultural flowering, scientific discovery, and artistic achievement. The parallels between medieval witch hunts and modern phenomena are deeply unsettling. Social media pile-ons can destroy lives based on unsubstantiated accusations. Political movements still use scapegoating to explain complex social problems. Conspiracy theories spread at lightning speed, turning neighbors against each other. The tools may have changed, but the underlying human tendencies remain the same. In our current era of polarization and misinformation, the witch trials serve as a warning about what happens when fear overcomes reason and prejudice triumphs over evidence. They remind us that civilized societies are always vulnerable to descent into barbarism when citizens abandon critical thinking in favor of comfortable scapegoating. The legal reforms that ended witch persecution requirements for corroborating evidence, exclusion of torture-extracted confessions, establishment of appeals processes, emerged from hard-won lessons about human nature and the corrupting influence of unchecked power. These protections must be constantly defended against those who would sacrifice justice for expediency or popular approval. The economic aspects of witch persecution also resonate with modern concerns about inequality and the exploitation of vulnerable populations. The systematic transfer of wealth from accused witches to their persecutors prefigured later forms of legalized theft that targeted marginalized communities. Understanding these patterns can help us recognize similar dynamics in contemporary society. The role of professional witch-finders, who profited from creating and exploiting fear, finds echoes in modern grifters who monetize division and paranoia. These individuals understood that there was money to be made from human suffering and found ways to systematize and profit from persecution. Their methods may have evolved, but their fundamental approach remains unchanged. The involvement of children as both accusers and victims in witch trials offers sobering lessons about protecting young people from adult manipulation. The capacity of authority figures to coach children into providing false testimony for political purposes represents a form of abuse that continues to this day in various contexts. The international nature of witch persecution, facilitated by the printing press and shared ideological frameworks, parallels how harmful ideas can now spread globally through digital communication networks. The same mechanisms that spread the Malleus Maleficarum across Europe now spread conspiracy theories and hatred across the internet at unprecedented speed. Yet, the eventual decline of witch persecution also offers hope. The same human capacity for reason and compassion that ultimately ended the trials remains available to us today. The Enlightenment values of evidence-based thinking, individual rights, and institutional checks on power emerged partly as responses to the horrors of the witch hunts. The scientific revolution that challenged supernatural explanations for natural phenomena provides a model for combating modern forms of superstition and conspiracy thinking. The legal reforms that made witch trials impossible offer templates for protecting vulnerable populations from persecution. The gradual expansion of human rights and dignity builds on foundations laid by those who opposed the witch hunts. Understanding the full horror of the medieval witch trials is essential not just for historical accuracy, but for recognizing the warning signs when similar dynamics emerge in our own time. The victims of these persecutions deserve to be remembered not as statistics, but as individuals whose lives were cut short by humanity's capacity for organized cruelty. Their deaths serve as eternal testimony to the darkness that lies dormant in human hearts, and the vigilance required to keep that darkness from consuming the light of civilization. The witch trials remind us that the price of freedom and justice is constant watchfulness against those who would sacrifice both for power and control. How could things have been different? The persecution could have been prevented by several key changes. Strong, centralized legal systems with consistent procedures and appeals processes would have made arbitrary accusations much more difficult. Educational reforms promoting scientific thinking and critical analysis could have challenged the supernatural worldview that enabled the trials. Economic policies addressing inequality and providing social support for vulnerable populations would have removed some of the motivations for scapegoating. Most importantly, the cultivation of intellectual courage among leaders and citizens could have created resistance to mass hysteria. There were individuals throughout the persecution period who recognized the trials as unjust, but they were often silenced or became victims themselves. A culture that protected and rewarded moral courage rather than punishing dissent could have prevented much of the suffering. The witch trials stand as one of history's clearest examples of what happens when fear replaces reason, when prejudice overwhelms evidence, and when power corrupts justice. They remind us that civilized society is not a given but an achievement that must be constantly maintained and defended. In our modern world, facing new forms of polarization, scapegoating, and persecution, the lessons of the witch trials remain painfully relevant. The same psychological and social mechanisms that enabled the systematic murder of tens of thousands of innocent people continue to operate today, waiting for the right combination of fear, authority, and opportunity to emerge once again. The screams of the victims, silenced centuries ago, still echo as warnings for those wise enough to listen. They challenge each generation to choose compassion over cruelty, evidence over prejudice, and justice over power. In remembering their suffering, we honor not only their memory but also our responsibility to prevent such horrors from recurring. The medieval witch trials represent both humanity's capacity for unspeakable evil and our potential for learning from our darkest moments. Whether we choose to heed these lessons or repeat these mistakes will determine the kind of world we leave for future generations. The choice, as always, remains ours. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most tragic and misunderstood stories. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel. I am dedicated to uncovering the hidden, untold stories in history. Ring that notification bell, because the next untold story will move you more than this. Until then, question the narratives, listen to the silenced voices, and never stop seeking the truth behind the legends.